The entire Crazy Clan had been reunited now for almost a year, and we spent the time doing all of our classwork. Each of us had plans for moving into an apartment complex and continuing our traditions. My economics class held a project dealing with supply and demand. We had to pretend that we distributed things that people our age bought in high quantities. The grade was going to become part of our final exam. With this type of pressure placed upon my shoulders, I knew the perfect solution. I was going to do the project about condoms. It's a given fact that teenage boys 17 plus buy them for the reasons they're made for. Everyone helped me put the statistic together, while I drew up the graphs and charts. Knowing my classmates were doing things like cars and candy, I felt it better to be mature and realistic. Little did I know that the selection was going to be my downfall. 2 weeks after I turned the project in to my teacher, I heard the familiar static on the PA system. Felipe Aradox to the dean's office. The dean's secretary sounded monotone and robotic, as always. I got up from class and walked down the hall, unsure as to what I was heading towards. Stopping at the door, I adjusted my glasses and combed my hair. A cold hand gripped my stomach as I grasped the door handle. Taking a breath, I plunged headfirst into the jaws of death. Mrs. Gibson sat at her desk looking at my project through her spectacles. She looked up and gestured me to sit down. "Why did you do a project such as this?" she asked with a hint of disgust. I wanted to be more realistic. I took my notes from medical journals and various polls. I explained, watching her every move. "Did you know that your teacher has taken high offense to this project of yours and is calling it a form of sexual harassment?" she asked me, giving me the dead stare. Those 2 words drove a dagger of fear into me. This was not what I intended. I wanted only to pass this class. The words for defense became jumbled as I sat stone-faced and silent, listening to the decision. "I've already called your parents about this matter, and we have come to the conclusion that you will not be graduating this month. Don't worry, though. You can make the class up this summer." The words slowly sank in. The dreams of all of us gathering before the stage with diplomas and group hugs shattered. Nausea clamped into my stomach, and I walked away from the office in silence. That Monday morning was the start of what I called Hell Week. As school ended, I drove home praying the day would end. My parents were sitting at the kitchen counter waiting for me when I opened the door. My father didn't look up at me or acknowledge my greeting. I sat down across from them, waiting for whatever was about to happen. 20 minutes passed in agonizing silence until my mother spoke up. "In regards to the phone call from this morning, we've come to the conclusion that you are an absolute disappointment to the family. Until you can prove yourself again, you are nothing to us but a boarder." I walked into my bedroom and shut the door, looking around at all my pictures and graduate cards. I started to slide into a deep depression. That day I remained in bed and soon drifted to sleep. Tuesday morning, I showed up at the cafeteria with the others, but my mood was still somber. I closed myself off from my friends and wrote poems in my notebook. After school, I went home to get my uniform ready for work. I walked inside and found my father half slumped in a drunken stupor. I ignored him and got ready for work. I noticed an empty space in the room by my dresser and grew silently worried. My mother came to the door and answered my silent question. "Your father lost his job today. We decided that since you're not graduating, we need you to go ahead and get more hours at work. We also are going to sell your guitar. We need the money, and you have to learn that life is never fair and dreams don't come true." I kept my temper and drove to work, holding back the frustration. My manager asked me to come into his office. I was already trying to stop myself from shaking. "Listen, we've been having budget problems, and so corporate is telling us that we need to let some people go. I'm sorry about that, but you can use me for a reference," he said, shaking my hand as we walked to the entrance. I handed him the uniform in silence and drove home. My parents had gone out and the house was dark. I sat in the living room and thought about the past few days and the words spoken. My depression was getting worse. Finally, I decided to follow in my father's footsteps and opened the liquor cabinet. Within an hour, the bottles were empty, my senses were washed in misery, and my last lines of sanity snapped. Feeling worthless and knowing that my fears of failure had come true, I dragged myself to the bathroom and opened the medicine chest. Flipping off the cap of sleeping pills, I dumped a handful into my mouth and washed it down with wine from the refrigerator. The phone rang off and on. I heard Scott and Chris. Then everything went black. I woke up briefly to see the buildings moving backwards and the bright beam of light coming from the paramedic. Then I came to my senses fully inside of a white room with padded walls. My stomach was pumped and I lay on the floor, laughing to myself. The infamous psycho had come home. The 3 days I spent in the hospital I considered as a small vacation. For the first time in my life, I was able to lay in the bed and write some notes down and take an objective view of my life. After a day in between doctors, I turned the radio to my favorite rock station and continued to put my writings together. My thoughts became interrupted, though, by a familiar voice on the air. "Hi there, I was wondering if you could play a song for me." It was Scott. "Yes, what would you like to hear?" the DJ at the station asked. "Well, my brother is in the hospital after having an accident and I wanted to let him know I'm thinking about him. Would you play Shine On by Pink Floyd?" The song began and I smiled, wiping away teardrops from my eyes. I felt somewhat idiotic for taking such a drastic measure. As the last guitar chords finished, I heard another voice come on the air. This time it was Chris. "Listen, my brother got involved in an accident the other day and almost died. He's okay now from what I've heard, and I want to play a song for him and tell him I'm thinking about him." The DJ took a breath for a moment and then asked him, "Are you related to the guy that called 5 minutes ago?" "Yes, that's our baby brother, I heard." "Isn't it great that you have a whole family of listeners? Anyways, please play I Want to Be Sedated. Thank you in advance." 5 minutes later, 2 sets of voices came on the air. It was John and Tom. "You're probably getting sick of us, but would you play a song for our brother and let him know that we're all thinking about him? Please play Comfortably Numb by Pink Floyd. Thank you." It was funny that each song they chose either dealt with insanity or similar themes. Their thoughts and gestures helped me through the rest of the recovery process, and to this day I have never forgotten their effort. The observation times had finished and I was permitted to go home. As I drove to my house, I started to think about the past few days. Imagine my surprise when I turned down my road to see some familiar cars lined along the driveway.